Senator Gallagher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. The very generous contributions about Senator Hutchins' career. I go back to the period of 93 to 98 where Steve was arguably the most successful union leader in Australia. The New South Wales branch had the highest rates. The state awards were higher than federal awards. The owner-driver rates were higher than anything achieved federally, and there was a jurisdiction in which they could get resolution were there any problems. And I came into the leadership group of the TWU about 96, and Steve was at the absolute height of his power. He taught us to campaign and win, and the confidence that the man displayed in those campaigns was extraordinary. I mean, I was a very junior person in that leadership group, looking for someone to display some leadership, some courage and some achievement, and Steve was the epitome of all of that. The 15% campaign that was mentioned, we didn't actually believe we could do that, but with Steve's leadership as the federal president, he was able to pull that campaign off. He had a really interesting leadership style. He knew who he disagreed with, and he made some interesting comments about people in our different branches, because we were essentially a federation of 7 warring branches. But as soon as the bell was rung, we were all on the same side. And whilst he may have had his differences with other branches, he was so excellent at leading people that as soon as the battle was started, you know, his enemies were the first ones to go to his aid. He was an extraordinary leader in that respect. And the generations that he inspired to follow on from him are still there. You know, Wayne Fournay, you know, Tony Sheldon, Michael Caine, all of those organisers that were there yesterday at the funeral. He left behind a legacy in that 5-year period which still affects and helps and furthers the interests of all working people in Australia today. And I think, you know, a truly extraordinary contribution for the wider Labor movement. And it was driven off his simple principles. A deal's a deal and you never rat. If you rat once, you'll rat twice, so you never rat. And he stuck to his principles and his guns for all of his working life, and I too add my condolences to his wife and children and grandchildren.
Thank you, Senator Gallagher. Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President, and I don't want to interrupt the TWU contribution, but I did want to briefly make a contribution in recognition and remembrance of Steve Hutchins. Perhaps this isn't the right time to say this, but there aren't a lot of people in this chamber that I would bother to have a beer with, but Steve Hutchins was one of them. And that's unusual for me, because I usually keep my distance from members of the Labor Party, but Steve was a great guy, never vicious. Well, that I saw. Perhaps he might have been in the TWU, but he was never vicious in his arguments and his approach to the work that we do in this Senate. I'm sorry, circumstances yesterday and timing and place was something that really prevented a lot of people attending his funeral, which I would have liked to have done had circumstances been different. But I did want to simply place on my record the very high regard I had for Steve Hutchins. He and I think was Michael Forshaw, one of his mates, occasionally as lunchtime meetings of a visiting delegation or something would finish, there'd be 3 of us left in the lunchtime room, sort of making sure that none of the alcohol went back into the cupboard. And Steve and Michael and I would then solve all the problems of the world, including some of the Labor Party, I might say. And no doubt I think they probably gave me a bit of advice about how to solve any problems, a few problems the Liberal Party might have had at any particular time. But he was a great guy. I say this, and I understand from what Senator Gallagher has said and from what others have said, and I have been listening to the debate whilst meeting with other people. Steve was very loyal to his cause, very loyal to the Labor Party, but I know he was at times disappointed that the party in those days, not those currently here, weren't quite as loyal to him. And I remember in one of his early bouts of illness, I went to see him in the hospital when he was here in Canberra, and he said to me, "You know, Ian, it's strange. I've been a lifelong member of the Labor Party. I've done, everything I can to them. I've remained loyal." But he said, "The only people who have come to see me in hospital are three Liberals." I think it was Jeannie Ferris, the late Jeannie Ferris. I think Bill Heffernan was one of them, and me. And he was clearly disappointed because he did actually mention it, that a group that had done so much, that he had done so much for and been so loyal to, hadn't recognised the difficulty he was in right in the beginning. This was many years ago now when he was in the Senate. I appreciate that many of those in the Labor Party now were not in the Senate when Steve Hutchins was here. I was for all of the time he was here. He was a great man. I never really knew his wife and family, but I do extend to them my condolences. And can I just say that I did want to be associated with the condolence motion, and Steve, rest in peace. Have a few beers up there in the big palace in the sky or wherever you are, and I'm sure we all look forward to sometime in the future perhaps catching up with Steve again in another life.
Thank you, Senator McDonald.
Madam Deputy President, one of the first people I met when I came into this place was Steve Hutchins. He actually came up to me and stuck his hand out and said, "I suppose you're the new lefty from Queensland," and followed up very quickly after that, "And why are you wearing that cross?" And I said, "Hello?" Basically, I'd found out later that my friend Huey Williams, about whom I spoke in this place quite recently, had called Steve and asked him to look after me. I'm not quite sure who looked after whom, and I'm not sure why these two blokes felt that I needed to be looked after, but it was the start of a really special friendship that I treasured with Steve Hutchins. I'm not going to go on about being the victim of these various pranks. Not only did he steal your question, as we've heard, he'd actually make loud comments while you were preparing to give it about the quality of the question and some policy issues you could throw into the question to make it stronger. And when you're first here, as we all know, when you first hear, that's quite nerve-wracking at the time. We laughed because, that special photograph that you get when you make your first speech of you looking noble and standing. My first photograph is a great photograph of Steve Hutchins because he's sitting beside me looking as though he was vaguely interested. Now, that was showing what a splendid actor he was, but the photograph is dominated by Steve's face, and he thought that was a really good result. In terms of why I wanted to particularly make a comment this afternoon, it's about the inspirational and engaging work that Steve did on the Community Affairs Committee. We've heard how he treasured his work, but I just wanted to put some comments, actually stimulated by some people that I still keep in contact with that were involved in these inquiries, who wanted their expressions put on record in this place. Whilst he actually was a chair of many inquiries, the three I want to mention in particular this afternoon are the poverty inquiry, which was the first major inquiry in which I was involved, and he was the chair. And it went on for a significant period of time and actually came up with some very important threshold comments about the state of poverty in our nation. But what I remember most about it is the personal way with which Steve talked with people who had come to us, many of whom were very vulnerable, some of whom had never given evidence to a Senate inquiry before, but because of the nature of this topic, they felt they needed to want to come and talk about what their lives were in suffering in incredible poverty and pressure in their communities. And Steve, as a chair, took so much personal time to make them feel valuable, to make them feel important, and to get them to share their stories. And I watched him with admiration as he spent time before and after they gave evidence and worked with them and made them feel that they were important and thanked them for their time. That effort actually resulted in getting evidence on the record which I think is invaluable and timeless. And if anyone has the opportunity to have a look at that particular inquiry report, you will see that we found out about things that were happening in our community that I don't think many really know, and about the pain and the vulnerability that existed then and still exists now. So that came amongst us to be called the Hutchins Inquiry. I think it should be renamed for that into the future. But his work actually was so valuable at that time. And as you would remember, the Shadow Minister at the time was Wayne Swan. And they worked very closely together during that process. And I think that document stands the test of time. The second one is one that Steve actually drove. It was one that was very important to him, and that was on hepatitis C in our community. Again, an issue that not many people know about, but Steve met some people in his electorate that had contracted hepatitis C through blood transfusion, and it angered him. It angered him that in the 20th century, when this occurred, the 21st century we're having the inquiry, that in the 20th century in Australia, people would be able to contract such an horrific condition with all the pain and the stigma that is around that condition, and he was determined that their voices would be heard and that the process would be addressed so that not only in Australia but across the world there'd be two results. One would be that our blood transfusion service would ensure that such a problem would not occur again, and secondly, that the terrible stigma around hepatitis B and C in our community would be identified and addressed. And he saved a very special anger for people within the medical profession who were not treating people with respect. And he took this not only through the Senate process, but into the wider community. And I remember when that report came down, there was a large number of people who were gathered, and Steve was in tears as he was delivering his report, and he made a commitment that the knowledge that came out of that inquiry would not be lost. And of course the third one was the one to which Senator Brandis so beautifully addressed, which was the inquiry into institutional care. We worked really closely on that particular committee, and it did have an impact. But Steve actually did not just leave it in terms of having hearings and coming up with recommendations, and a very strong series of recommendations in that report, which we all know about. But he then became patron of the CLAN network, the Care Leavers Network of Australia. He didn't talk to many people about that decision, but I can assure you that the people in the Clan Leavers Network respect and love Steve Hutchins. And they love him because he cared about them. They love him because they knew that he cared so sincerely about their needs and was always available to talk to. So the inquiry engagement did not end when the report was presented in this place. His engagement with the people who were in fact survivors of this horrible time in our history, they felt that he was there for them from then on. And certainly when we heard that Steve, I don't like using that term battle with cancer, it's almost become meaningless, but there was a long time that this man had been ill and was often quite ill here, but just kept on doing his job. But that when they heard that we'd lost him, they particularly wanted his family and also the wider community know about the respect and the importance that Steve Hutchins had for them. I know, and I just want to end up, Madam Deputy President, I know for Natalie and the family that they are grieving greatly. I want them to know that there are many people sharing their grief and their love for Steve, because with Steve, and we've heard before, when it came to issues around his family, he lit up. I mean, that term is used a lot, but he actually lit up when he was talking about Natalie and his family, all of them. he was so proud of them. But when that little boy was born, which was while we were in this place, I have never seen a prouder, happier man. And one of the joys is that he was able to be with his son for such a long time, which was at the time something he didn't know. So, Natalie, and for your family, know that your man was loved by many of us.
Thank you, Senator Moore.